Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome back everyone. That was a great panel. Love the video. I know that video was a lot of work that was put into that. A lot of people chipped in to help pay for it too. So that was a great surrogate for our field trip, which I promised to do a phase 2 of this meeting and take Jeff Rivera up on his offer to show us some of the sites up there at Lake Wenatchee. So stay tuned for that. Our next speaker is our featured speaker. Would have been our banquet speaker last year. Was our banquet speaker 9 years before that. Is Jack Nisbet, the author of several collections of essays that explore the human and natural history of the Northwest, including books like Visible Bones, which is my favorite, and Ancient Places. He has also written award-winning biographies of cartographer David Thompson and naturalist David Douglas. In 2018, the Washington State Historical Society presented Nisbet with the Robert Gray Medal for distinguished and long-term contributions to Pacific Northwest history. Nisbet's most recent project, The Dreamer and the Doctor, traces the unlikely adventures of the late 19th century forest surveyor John Lieberg and his physician wife, Carrie, around the Intermountain West and beyond. For more information, you can check out your program, and the website's right there at jacknisbet.com. So take it away, Jack.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, and thanks for putting this on. I have really benefited from it today. The speakers have been amazing, and I especially love the way that George and Vicki and Paul and the whole panel, all the panels have said things that resonate with what I want to say now. I got onto this couple, John and Carrie Lieberg, through a bunch of people who told me I should look at them. The first one was Steve Arno, the fire ecologist from the Bitterroot that a lot of you probably know. And it took me about 25 years to take their advice. And it's sort of a convoluted story, and all I have to do today is just look at the forestry part of it. But I have to go back a little bit and tell you where John Lieberg is coming from, because it's just it's standard Northwest on the one hand, and it's a unique perspective on the other. He started off, he grew up in Malmo, Sweden, came over like many immigrants by himself as a 15-year-old teenager, ended up like many Scandinavian immigrants in Iowa in the Midwest, got married, got a job with the railroad, had a couple kids, and was just living a pretty respectable life. And then again, like many Scandinavian and other immigrants, he dropped out and started moving. And he got a job with the Northern Pacific in Mankato, Minnesota, the year that they completed the tracks to the Pacific. And that was a huge change to the whole ball game of forests that he only came to understand later, but he was in the forefront of in a way that is so perfect for the way that we want to think about this guy. As soon as the Northern Pacific completed their tracks, they started putting out flyers to attract people to come homestead. And these flyers make it look like Western North Dakota and Eastern Montana are these beautiful treed landscapes that you could grow something on. And Lieberg was a plant guy all his life. And he was the man who planted box elders beside the railroad grade going west, so that people would think that there was something that they were coming to besides pretty rough country for being a homesteader. And if you look down in the lower left corner, you can see they also made underground mining look like it was some kind of carnival ride, that it was just going to be fun when you got out here and everybody was going to make it. And he's part of it. So he's got a job he really likes. He watches all his box elders die over the course of a hot summer. He goes to Mount Rainier and collects plants this is a Western wallflower. There's a Western wallflower specimen in the Smithsonian from John Lieberg. I mean, there's 10,000 of his specimens in the National Herbarium. There's another 14,000 in the University of Oregon Herbarium. So he gets around and he thinks of himself as a plant god. I think that's important too. But you can't make money as a plant god. So he decides, as he goes through Pritchard, and there's this huge mining boom going on, that he's going to come back, and his favorite place to come back to and look at is the inland Northwest. So in 1884, he gets off the train at Spokane, goes to Lewiston, buys a horse, and makes a loop that foreshadows his whole career, really. He goes up the Clearwater River through what is now the Nez Perce Reservation and loops north along the North Fork across the ridge to the St. Mary and St. Joe and on back to Lake Pend Oreille. And he goes back to Minnesota, where he still lives, and does a paper for the Minneapolis Natural History Club that describes this trip, which he says is only going to look for places that he can do mining claims. So he rides out the Clearwater through the Nez Perce Reservation, and he sees these big ponderosas with a lot of space between them, which we've been talking about all day, and says, and this very faint bell goes off in his mind that the tribes are managing land, and he is seeing the result of long-term management. He gets over the divide between the Clearwater and the St. Joe and St. Mary's on that ridge, and gets down into an incredible mess, what we would call patchy, where he's like walking over deadfall and fire problems and all these little young forests. And then he'll come to a big cedar grove. This is the Hobo Grove on the St. Joe here. And it just boggles his mind what's going on, but he is not seeing the life that he expected to see in a big virgin forest. And then he realizes that all the life is in the cleared spaces where a big cedar has fallen down and created an opening, and the butterflies and the songbirds are on the edge of the opening. Again, this is his very first paper when he's just starting out. He's having these insights that really resonate with the way we try to think today. As he comes up into the Coeur d'Alene country, there's a lot of mining going on there, and he's seeing some problems. He's seeing a lot of what he calls carelessly set fires. Prospectors at that time in steep country, if they saw an outcrop, they just torched it off so they could see the rocks better. And that is ruining a resource. So he notes that, but he's much more interested in these rock outcrops, and he makes that clear. So he comes back. He brings not his wife or his two kids. He brings another woman and another new baby. And that woman is named Carrie Lieberg. She is a physician. And for the rest of the book that I've written, it's about public health, human health, and forest health, or public health and public land management is another way to say it. Two aspects of our lives that we have just done a terrible job of figuring out over the last 100 years, which again is what we've been trying to think about today. This is Lake Pend Oreille, looking straight out the tail of it where the Ice Age flood came out. That's Mount Bernard on the left and Cape Horn on the right. John Lieberg homesteaded on what is now called Eucalyptus Point as a nod to the Ice Age floods, but it's Farragut State Park. And that was his and Carrie's homestead. We're looking at Mount Spokane and Mica Peak in Washington. So he had a beautiful place for a homestead where he could, think about what it was going to do. And he and Carrie built a little cabin. They raised Carrie's son. They had their chickens and their horses, and they were trying to grow hay. They were doing all the things, but he was out doing prospecting for the most part. And he pioneered a trail called the Athol Lieberg Trail on Forest Service maps until the 50s, going from the railroad on Rafton Prairie across Chilco's Saddle down into the little North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River, which was not on any maps at the time. So he sort of had it, he and his neighbors had it to themselves. And he did about over 30 mining claims there with Carrie and with other people over the next 10 years. trying to get rich and failing, as most prospectors do. And he named it, he named a lot of things in the Panhandle National Forest and other national forests. He called it the Trail River because that's a county that he lived in for a while in North Carolina, in North Dakota, Trail County. So when you can see these little clues from his world on the map today. So while he is prospecting, he's also picking up plants because he can't stop himself. He writes that he's been doing it since a kid. His dad told him it was a waste of time, but he just couldn't help himself from doing plant specimens. And he's short on money. He starts sending some back east because the big herbariums at Harvard and New York, what became New York Botanical Society, yeah, others, they're trying to build up their herbariums, and the inland Northwest has not been collected very much. There haven't been people out here. So he's writing, he's just sending it back saying, hey, I've got indigenous plants like Idaho gold thread, or I've got these orchids that are abundant here, and I will send specimens or live plants back. What do you think? And he gets some response from the botanical community, which is a tightly woven small community at the time, and people start showing up out there. And he makes contact with this powerhouse of a woman named Elizabeth Knight Britton, who is a botanical wizard. She's a young woman. Her husband teaches botany at Columbia University. He's a geologist, though. She can't teach there because she's a woman at the time. So all these themes keep recurring in this book that seem relevant today. But she and her husband are instrumental in beginning the New York Botanical Society. And she is corresponding with many amateurs like Lieberg, mentoring them through the process. And they work up this correspondence. And the only reason we know what John Lieberg was doing at this time, between about 1884 and 1893, is his letters to Britain. And the only reason we know anything about Carrie Lieberg at all is that Britain was a sympathetic figure, and she formed a friendship with Carrie. And you go in the file in the New York Botanical Society and in the John Lieberg's file, some of the letters are from Carrie. That's a whole nother story. But the ones that John sends are these charming things. They might be 20 pages long. And here he is, he finds this amazing Alcea moth that's hanging in long festoons from the underside of the shelving rock, which are the rocks that the Cordilleran ice was anchored to before it came apart and made the Ice Age floods. It's amazing stuff. And this is serious science. Britain is very serious. John has a microscope that is probably the dissecting scope that Carrie used in medical school at the Women's College of Chicago, where she got her physician's degree, very rare for a woman at the time. And so he can look at things through a good microscope. And he and Britton publish a paper with Britton as the author and him as some mosses collected in North Idaho that has 100 species in it, many of them new. And these are Britton's illustrations. She's a terrific scientific illustrator of this micro world of mosses, which you have to love John Lieberg, because he had this rare ability to look at things very close up and then to have all these grand theories about much larger things. So he's writing to Carrie about these tiny little details of moss in Latin that they're arguing about. And then he'll say, oh yeah, and there's all these fires up here. Sometimes the Indians are setting them, and lots of times the homesteaders are careless and letting them get out. And if you look, this is Father Nicholas Point on the Coeur d'Alene country, only 40 years before Lieberg, this is a painting of somebody who is terrified of fire, right? He's like us today. And this is the Coeur d'Alenes doing a deer drive, which is everyday work for them. They're driving deer, they're managing the forest, they're doing what they do. To Point, it looks like utter chaos. That's one of the real metaphors I think we've really heard today over and over is nature tends to bring order out of chaos and then bring chaos out of order. And if you aren't paying close attention, the chaos seems to reign. Lieberg is homesteaded next to a traditional Kalispel winter village near where Bayview, Idaho is today, right next to Farragut Park. And he thinks that they're barbarians because he describes to Britain that they're chasing deer into the lake and people are waiting out there in canoes and clubbing them, just like we see in the picture here. And it's the idea. I mean, when you read a letter like that and go, wait a minute, I thought the Kalispel disappeared in 1840 and lived in Canada. What do you mean they're living in this archaeological winter village where they've been around? The world is so complex and so over interwoven in, again, the ways that we've heard described this morning. And people are a huge part of that. And it's really hard to tease apart what's going on and make a straight through line story that is coherent because of that. So that's one simple thing. But fire is a theme that occurs over and over again in Lieberg's writing because it's a big part of the landscape. And that's what he's interested in. In 1889, it's a bad fire year. It's such a bad fire year that he gets driven off his claims in the Little North Fork and has to go hole up at his homestead and just try to make sure it doesn't burn. Meanwhile, the entire city of Spokane burns. And he describes to a letter to Britain, got on the train this afternoon and rode into Spokane to see the results of the great conflagration. And you go, huh? We think we've seen some bad wildfires. And we think that a lot of people think, a lot of the general public thinks that 1910 is when wildfires even started in the world. But 1889 is a very fiery year, and you can go anywhere and see amazing results from it. And Lieberg starts looking for those. And over the next winter, there are snowslides and avalanches that bury a couple towns in the Silver Valley in Coeur d'Alene, where there's this big silver mining boom going on. This is a photograph taken from that year, in fact. And he writes a letter back to Britain that he has no sympathy for them. They've been doing this destructive style mining without paying attention to the landscape for several years now, not that long, 5 years. And it's been tearing the land up. And the soil is the key to holding on to the moisture. And if you don't do it, the whole hillside will come down. They have been reaping what they have been sowing for many years. And again, there's not many people at this time looking at long-term cause and effects like Lieberg did. And he is just a guy. We don't think he had any more education than what he got in Malmo until he was 15. But he is so plugged into the landscape and has such an intuitive feel for it that many of the things that he says resonate now with what we're trying to do, and resonate now and really set a framework to ask the kinds of questions we're asking now. What is the land going to look like 100 more years down the road when you throw in all the factors that we add? So again, he is nose to the grindstone, prospecting and collecting and doing all these things for the next few years, never quite making it in the mining world, while this depression is growing, while the glut of silver from the Silver Valley is tearing up, part of what's tearing up the US economy, and a huge depression comes. It's called the Panic of 1893. And he's thinking maybe he'll get a job. And through Elizabeth Britton, he gets what we would call a seasonal job with the Forest Service, where the USDA, of course, we don't have the Forest Service yet, but the USDA hires him to do a plant survey from Spokane to Stevens Pass, which is right in the heart of, again, everything we've talked about today. And the person who hires him is a 26-year-old botanist named Frederick Coville, who goes on to be head of the National Herbarium, which again is not quite there yet. But when it gets to be an entity, he is the first head of it. He's an amazing young botanist. Lieberg is not a kid. He's 41. He's already had 3 lives before he starts this. But this is what he's always wanted to do. His boss, his supposed boss, is a physician botanist from Minneapolis named Sandberg, who's already been out here, who's already stolen some of the credit for some of Lieberg's plant discoveries in the Idaho Panhandle, and who has a bad leg. So Lieberg gets the job, again, as like anybody who's just starting out as a seasonal. He's in charge of the animals, he's in charge of the wagon, he's in charge of feeding, he's in charge of keeping camp, and he's in charge of relations with the local people as they make this trip. Sandberg has a bad leg and all he does is sit in camp and do the determinations on the plants that Lieber goes out and collects and brings back. So he's a busy guy. And this is reflected in very amusing ways in the letters that he writes to Elizabeth Britton and then as he goes along to Frederick Coville. But he is on fire because it's what he has wanted to do. And he realizes that. And he keeps a journal that is the first daily journal that we have from him besides these letters. And it is terrific. It's a trip that starts at Hangman Creek. They go 6 miles up Hangman Creek and pitch at camp where there's a golf course in Spokane now. And he describes the bluffs that are flood terraces above Hangman Creek. He describes them just as you would describe them now. He makes his terrific plant list that has many of the plants that you can see if you go outside right now and walk on it. And then from there, he goes on, basically following the flood path down through the Cheney-Palouse scablands. He goes and visits Rock Lake. Coville has sent him a set of instructions that's not unlike the set of instructions Jefferson sent to Lewis and Clark, where he's supposed to map the forest, the extent of the forest out into the sagebrush desert, because nobody's ever done it. Nobody's ever divided the desert into different kinds of plant communities and habitats. Nobody has ever talked to the farmers and homesteaders that are out there going broke to see what works and what doesn't work. And nobody's ever tried to put the geology of the landscape into some kind of focus. But then Coville is an avid mountain climber. So he says, you know, go on up to Stevens Pass and get there in time to climb some of those Cascade volcanoes, because those are supposed to be cool when you get out there. And we want to know what plants are up top also. So Lieberg's here at Rock Lake looking at some terrific plants and realizing that the depressions in the lava flows all show powerful eroding actions, that these have been torn out by some kind of crazy flood. He moves west doing things like collecting the first cheatgrass found in the continental United States and sending it back to Washington, things like that. He gets to the Grand Coulee area and goes and explores Soap Lake and Lake Lenoir, and then comes back down and crosses the Freight of Fan and realizes that this boulder drift of very large dimensions composed of basalt and granite has come directly through Grand Coulee and the lakes that they just visited the other day. So what does he do? He takes 2 days off from his trip, his supposed exploration trip, and walks south to Moses Lake and watches the granular size go from boulders down to rocks, down to gravel, down to sand, until he's at the sand dune system south of Moses Lake, which is today buried under Potlatch Reservoir. Pottles Reservoir. He's really, his mind is going 100 miles an hour with each one of these entries. And again, he has a very focused mind, but it can be very broad horizontally at the same time. He keeps seeing these archaeological sites, these kitchen middens from old tribal campsites, and he keeps noticing this plant, which we usually call white sand verbena now, but that David Douglas described in 1826 when he was in this country. And Lieberg has read up on everything Lewis and Clark did and everything David Douglas did, and gone and looked at specimens of both of them because they are his heroes and he wants to see what they're doing. And he realizes this sand verbena is everywhere, and it seemed to have been introduced by these ancient dwellers purposefully or otherwise and spread from their old camping grounds. And what he's talking about here is purposeful gardening, which we were all taught Plateau people never did, and that this is a cultural plant, which it doesn't show up on any cultural plant lists at the moment on the internet. But if you go to the Southwest, there's a very close cousin, fragrant sand verbena, that has many uses, hanging in your lodge to make it smell better, sticking a pillow with it, stuffing a pillow with it for a nice sleep, medicinal uses. Again, Lieberg is just getting the last glimmers of things that had dropped out, that were getting eroded away from the human culture in the areas we like. So they go on and cross the Columbia at Rock Island, just below Rock Island, and go up and look at the country around Wenatchee, which is already getting orcharded. They're already digging, trying to create flumes and irrigate everything. And then he takes the Chumstick Highway up to Leavenworth. And now we're in the forest, and we can start the talk and start talking about the forest that he sees. This is Icicle Creek. He goes up Icicle Creek into the Enchanted Lakes area. And on his way up, he finds the mountain ridges here were found to be quite dry and have frequently been burned in former years, swept by forest fires, causing the growth to be of rather sparse and small character. And he's trying, this is the beginning of him trying to expand time in his mind, where he saying, did this just happen? Has this always happened? Is there something about this place? Why is it so patchy here? What is the going on? And it dovetails into a lot of the slides that Paul was showing us, but Lieberg is a person who is on the ground looking at the formations there. And he learns how to do things with it. He learns how to make assumptions based on what he sees. Colville has told him to climb some of these volcanic peaks. So they get up close to the summit, and there's Glacier Peak. And he goes, wow, I don't know if we're going to be climbing that one anytime soon. He sees it August 14th, and their seasonal contract ends September 5th or something like that. So he doesn't have time to do that. So they go right up to Stevens Pass, where the Great Northern Railroad has just finished their tracks. 1893 is the year that they made those crazy tunnels at the portals that everybody has visited on Route 2. And he goes up and finds snow 10 to 15 feet deep in late August at 3,800 feet. So there's something that you can go check on with your snow stick this August, is to see how many places at 3,800 feet you can find snowdrifts that deep. And that's the places he's trying to climb and get up and look for alpine plants. It's just not working. It's still winter there. So he has to recalibrate. He's always adjusting his instructions and figuring out what to do on a practical level. And he's very proud of his ability to do that. He says, a prospector's life is a dog's life, but oh, how you learn the mountains. And plant expeditions could travel 1,000 miles and not learn a tenth of what a prospector learns during the course of a summer, when they're really looking for things, when they're really studying where they want to be and what the landscape is made out of. So he is trying to climb Mount Stewart from the Alpine Lakes Wilderness, what is now the Alpine Lakes Wilderness, and it was too snowy in July. So he goes back right at the end of August. He tries again. It's too steep. He goes and talks to somebody in town, because he's always talking to people. That's one of the great strengths of him, I think. He's always saying, this guy said this poor farmer said that his potatoes had all frosted out in July. He always gets that kind of local knowledge. He gets somebody to guide him up the backside, which is the easy way, and walks up to the top of Mount Stewart. But he gets up there, and the flora proved not to be quite at all alpine in character, notwithstanding its altitude. I think the reason for this is because Mount Stewart lies in the Wenatchee Range of mountains, within 50 miles of the Great Columbia Plains, the heated air of which sweeps around the mountain slopes and tempers the climate. And again, this is him really thinking about it and coming up with something that makes a lot of sense. And he describes it in the same language that Paul described it early this morning. It's a tug of war between these desert plants and the hot, dry air, and these alpine plants and the cool, wet air. And right now, the desert is winning this tug of war on Mount Stewart, because it's displaced a little east from the volcanoes like Glacier that are on the Pacific rim, the Pacific crest, and it's more in the influence of the desert. So it's losing the tug of war, which of course is happening back and forth for eons. And we happen to have landed in a part of it where, whoops, it's slipping a little bit to the hot and dry right at a time when we've let the forest slip into a little bit of too much canopy and a little bit of too much beetles and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And it makes for this conflagration that we're living inside of. But here's where it starts to get interesting, is he goes back home to Lake Pend Oreille and writes these crazy letters back to Frederick Colville. Sandberg, he doesn't care about, he's hardly ever mentioned again. Colville never hires Sandberg again. So Lieberg says he's going to do a general report of the expedition meant to embody all the features of flora, topography, etc., of the country traversed in the process by me, after which I will prepare a series of colored charts to exhibit at a glance the general topography, general and local floras, distribution and range of the forest areas, and limits of the species to trees composed of the same climatic features, area, everything we talked about today. He's going to put on these little charts. And this report is the only report, and Lieberg, it was not in Lieberg's contract to do this. It's the only report from a seasonal job like this that I haven't been able to find. But in going through his papers in DC at NARA, this little piece of paper fell out of one of his letters that is him trying to put everything in a box, trying to get plant associations the way you see them from Daubenmeier, and trying to put trees on elevations the way you see them in Alexander von Humboldt or in early Forest Service things. And again, he's Swedish, but he's fluent in German. English is his fourth or fifth language. And he's obviously read a lot of Humboldt. And at this same time, in DC, there's a very small, tight group of people who are also trying to take that to the next level. And C. Hart Merriam, who is considered in the US to be the person who is the father of these plant association books that lead to the big ring notebook that each forest has. He was the US biologist at this time. Frederick Coville invites Lieberg to jump on the train and go back to DC and figure out his plant determinations, but also to meet all these people, which lead to Gifford Pinchot, of course, eventually, and to think about what he wants to do next. And that was very far-sighted of Coville to do that, and very easy for Lieberg to do, because, I mean, what's the problem? Carrie is, all she has to do is hold down the homestead, have a job as a physician with a doctor's office, and raise a kid who appears to be on the autistic spectrum. She can do all that while he goes and tries to identify plants back in DC. It's great stuff. And again, it's what a lot of men were doing that I've studied back in my time. So Coville says, well, we got to look at more of this. Lieberg outlines a 4-year plant collecting expedition in Eastern Oregon. Coville finds him the money to do 1 year. So in 1894, he does this part where he takes the train to Walla Walla, and there's a spur that goes to Heppner. He rents a big farm wagon, or he buys a big farm wagon, gets some horses, gets a cook, and just starts heading out into the fossil area. He knows there's a summer expedition from Stanford University up there, then he wants to get in on the fossils too, but he's collecting plants all the way. And he is, again, his journal from this and his letters back to Coville, he writes copious letters back to Coville this year, and his plant list. We have all those things in his report. We have all those things from this trip, and they're astonishing as far as presenting a picture of Eastern Oregon and the Columbia Plateau in this time frame, in this tiny little summer of 1894. He meets tribal people digging biscuit roots, and he's real hung up on the different kinds of biscuit roots, and he learns from Umatilla people. That's, again, there's not that many botanists that are meeting and talking to tribal women out digging and learning from them. So that's one thing he does. He does it all the way down to Paulina and Crater Lake eventually. But when he cuts up into the Paulina Lakes caldera, that's when things start to come together for him. This is a beautiful mountain hemlock forest that surrounds the lakes. You can see that it's having a little problem with beetles there. And you can see the basalt flows encroaching on it and how there's a tug of war geologically going on here. And this is when he writes back to Charles Piper, who's just starting the herbarium at WSU. The present distribution and character of the flora of Idaho, Oregon, and Washington is most intimately connected with the recent geological history of this region and cannot be fully unraveled until the changes that have taken place since the beginning of the great basaltic metamorphoses are more fully understood. And I would suggest that you can take basalt out of that all the geologic changes and how that has worked and how the glaciers have worked to create the Wenatchees and the Cascades and the other places that we've talked about this morning. That's the part of the puzzle that needs to be included because it's important. And Lieberg really understood this. and really got into it. In 1895 and 1894, I guess ever since he went up into the Wenatchees and Cascades and climbed Mount Stewart, he's been leaning more towards forests and trees and paying more attention to them. And in 1895, Coville hires him again to do a summer plant survey of all the waters that drain into Lake Coeur d'Alene, which is a lot. And but it's his home country. He attacks it with gusto and makes an incredible plant list, but really pays attention to the trees and the plant associations in the way that a forester would. This is really, to me, his first timber survey. And he does amazing things. He has a habit of climbing 3 peaks to get himself oriented on the land. And the 3 he chooses here are Wiesner Peak, which is above Cataldo Mission, Stevens Peak, which a lot of you probably know, this right on the Bitterroot Divide, and Sunset Peak on the other side of the South Fork, where you can look down on the North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene, and you can see them all from each other. It's amazing what he did. And he just, again, he's just blowing himself up. The Northern Pacific is running tracks down in here, and they have a photographer named Haynes. And this is a picture he takes only the year before, this famous S trestle down by Elk City. And you can see that the landscape is burned up. And Lieberg, he just says that's what happens. If you have sparks from a steam engine, they set the woods on fire. If you have prospectors, they set the woods on fire. If you have homesteaders, they set the woods on fire. And we have to stop this careless burning. We're going to run a really good resource that we have here. And he talks about fire a lot on this trip. But he also goes up to the top. This is a ridge line. This is now Twin Crags Wilderness Study Area in the Panhandle Forest. This is Latour Baldy from Wiesner Peak, and it's all scree. Although when he was there, it was all scree with mountain hemlock almost to the top, and then white bark pine all along the top. Now there's mountain hemlock almost to the top, but then Douglas fir is mostly on the top. There are a few white barks left, but they're suffering. And he is asking himself questions like, why is this all scree? Which is a question geologists have asked ever since. And he realizes some of them are bare in the winter. And he is like snowshoeing up to places like in the winter to collect mosses in their fruiting state so he can send them to Elizabeth Britton. So this is one of his great trips. And again, it leads to a trip to Eastern Oregon in 1896, another amazing trip where Coville comes out and joins him, and they go up to Crater Lake together. They make a list of plant names from Klamath Marsh of almost 100 plants. They're from the Klamath language. It's pretty cool stuff. And then the big change happens. The big change is that the USGS is finally tasked with surveying all the forest reserves that have been named by President Cleveland, and then successive little turns where they're going to try to protect this public resource in the West, protect the forests of the West. That leads to the Forest Service and the mission statement we've been hearing all day. And Coville trades Lieberg straight up over to the USGS, which is run by Henry Gannett, who is known as Quad Gannett because he invented the quad maps system. And he wants everything to be squared out. So Gannett sends his surveyors out to do the boundaries of the Priest River Forest Reserve. And Lieberg's going to follow them and do a plant list, but also do a timber survey that has board feet in it. This is the first time he's looking at board feet and species and stands, et cetera, et cetera. And so Priest Lake goes over into Washington. It's the interior rainforest. It's got caribou in it. He sees all these things. He does a really good job of surveying it. Again, he's been there before. He's been there several times. He makes the recommendation to the powers that be, to Gannett, that you have to include the east slope of the Selkirks down to Bonner's Ferry in whatever national forest, whatever it turns out to be. You have to think about how you're going to, what you're going to take out of it and what you're going to take in. So he takes some of the areas out around the Pend Oreille River that can be agricultural. He sees miners up on the Continental Mine up near the border. He thinks they should have their shot at doing what they need to do. But he has specific recommendations for the different sides of the drainage, the different ways that the glacier came down, the different terrains that create different geology. And he recommends that they consolidate this checkerboard of state land and federal land into all one side and all the other side, which they took his recommendation because Gifford Pinchot, who was going to come meet him in 1896 in Eastern Oregon and got hung up with John Muir, he comes out to Priest in 1897 and meets Lieberg in Coolin. And I thought, as a researcher, I thought, wow, this is my big chance. I'm going to get into Gifford Pinchot's notebooks and find out something new about John Lieberg. And Gifford Pinchot kept these little vest pocket notebooks. And I find the one that is for his trip to Priest, and it says, met Lieberg. And it goes on to the next day. And all I know is that in writings that Pinchot did over the next bunch of years, he often uses the same syntax that Lieberg used in his reports from, say, the Coeur d'Alene about fire, about resource waste, about management, about a lot of those kinds of issues. Lieberg seems to, even in Lieberg's letters to Elizabeth written in the 1880s, he's saying a lot of the same things that really sound like the language that Pinchot uses later. It's totally fascinating. And here's an example, a couple of examples. First of all, he has the whole USGS to help him make maps, and he makes these amazing maps. This is just stems per acre, and the brown is burned areas. So if you zoom in on it, the dark green, there's a lot of stems per acre, and the brown is there's been a bunch of fires. The orange is agricultural, and he doesn't know what to think about a lot of this, but he's amazed and appalled at the same time about Priest, which has these beautiful white pine stands that are what everybody knows is the most valuable of the Western reserves as far as money dollar per acre value, because it's beautiful white pine premier. But Lieberg sees way beyond that. He goes to the east side of the lake and sees these very craggy, steep rise and talks about the geology there, and comes over to the west side, which is the Washington side. We're almost in Washington here, and sees these beautiful open meadows and realizes that the marshy flats occurring in the western half of the reserve are the result of beaver dams constructed ages ago. The fertility of the soil resides largely in the superficial layer of mold and humus. So this is Bismarck Meadows, which is the site of a restoration effort that's very collaborative, like some of the ones you've been talking about, to do a wetland, like some of the ones that Paul was talking about, where you've got to get some of these wetlands in the lower areas fixed up, or you're going to be it's hard to do the whole drainage without starting at the bottom. And he sees a bunch of fires there, and he realizes that on the hot fires where there's a closed canopy, it sterilizes the soil and it can't grow back in a rich manner in a way that allows him to collect cranberries there. Say he collects cranberries, that are a coastal plant. He sees red flowering currant, which is a coastal plant, that this is a rainforest with a lot of whole world of disjunct plants in it. Lieberg understands that. And he also understands that some of these fires are going to lead to this cycle of sterilize the soil, poor soil, dog hair, lodgepoles, and Doug fir are going to come back. And then you're just setting yourself up for getting another burn, another sterilized soil. How do you get out of that cycle? And he says it might take generations or several generations or hundreds of years or centuries to get out of this cycle and get it back to some kind of healthy forest. And of course, we're living inside the first century of that now. He's writing this 125 years ago, something like that. He also has a camera. He took a camera. This is a breakpoint in photography where you can take pictures with a one camera by yourself. And he took one to Eastern Oregon in 1896 and could never get the light readings because of the humidity and the dryness and the heat. So he brings an extra horse, a tripod, and a bunch of glass plates. And in his report, he has these glass plates. And here's a road supervisor building a road into Coolin, piling the slash up and then just setting it off so that it goes into the woods. And he is outraged. This is the white pines that everybody wants to get their hands on, and here they are ruined before you can get there. So he's trying to get his mind around this, around the Nez Perce, what he saw on the Nez Perce Reservation. He saw the same thing on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation between the Palouse River and the St. Mary's drainages. He sees the same thing in Spokane around the old Spokane House Fur Trade Post, where tribal management can look like it can make sense and fire is involved. Careless fires and hot fires don't make any sense. They aren't helping anything. And they're plunging some of these areas around Priest into a bad cycle that's going to be hard to get out of. So here's the next place he gets assigned, the Bitterroot, which includes everything that's in the Clearwater Forest and the Bitterroot Forest now, which is a gigantic area. It was the largest reserve at this time. The Washington one became a little larger when it was declared in this next year. But he starts off on the Montana side, works 3 passes, Lolo, Lost Horse, and Nez Perce, and just goes back and forth and then dives down into the Clearwater to get his information. And he does amazing work. He also has a camera, but he also, the ponderosa pine timber industry has gotten going in the Bitterroot Valley because there's a railroad spur down there and it's easy to get big trees out. And he starts going to sawmills, looking at the rings and counting and looking at fire scars. And these big light bulbs go on in his head that, of course, we all talk about now as just common knowledge, but nobody was doing it then. And he says, yeah, you can see that the Indians burned and that there were spot fires on a certain regime back in the day, if you're looking at a 700-year-old pine tree. But the year that John Mullen completed the Mullen Road in 1859, everything speeds up. And you can watch it speed up. You can watch that fire regimen narrow. And then the year that the Northern Pacific finishes their tracks in 1883, when Lieberg first came over, that's when it really gets into warp speed. And I think it's very comparable to us experiencing, our dial-up world to a computer world to whatever it is we're in now, to a cell phone world, where we think, oh my gosh, how can it speed up anymore? And then all of a sudden it's exponentially faster than it was. That's the way these tree rings look to him, the fire scars that he's looking at. So he's trying to process it. He's trying to look at the timber. He's trying to do this in a place where a lot of mining has taken place. There's a lot going on in the Clearwater. And he has these USGS mappers who are just amazing. So this is the range of alpine hemlock in the orange and alpine larch in the green, his 2 favorite trees. And this is him walking ridge lines to find those trees. and really, you can see the detail that he gets in. It's pretty amazing. He spent late summer, early fall of 1897, and then all of 1898 in this area. And his report is so amazing. Again, just one thing is, by walking these ridges, he looks down into the Bitterroot Valley and goes, I think this was all a big lake. I think that the whole Clark Fork Valley and down into the Bitterroot was all a big lake. I think there was a big ice dam on Lake Pend Oreille near my house, and that this was just this giant lake, and then it must have flooded out. He's not a scientist doing the work that Harlan Bretz does 20, 30, 40 years later, but he is visualizing it all because he spends time out on the landscape and he pays attention. And that's all he's really asking of anybody that he talks to and any of the agencies that he's complaining about. Why don't you just pay attention to what you're doing? Here's his, he not only takes photographs of burned areas, here's some beautiful yellow pine, but look down at the bottom. He's talking about 8,000 board feet per acre because he's now a timber cruiser. And this is what the Forest Service, this is going to end up as being the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service. And it's all these really interesting factors, the Spanish-American War and Teddy Roosevelt becoming a hero and resurrecting his political career and being buddies with Gifford Pinchot, and Gifford Pinchot, who's a European trained forester, coming out west and meeting John Muir, and getting into this Western view of how things might work. It all sort of comes together. And Lieberg is he's just a little insect on the ground seeing it all. And in his autobiography, which I think Paul said that he was looking at recently, Pinchot describes coming out and taking this trip with Muir, where he looks at all these reserves and goes, "Oh man, here's all we need to do. We need to do this, 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 this." Of course, I don't have time to do it. I don't have time to do this. I need men like John Lieberg and H.B. Ayers to do this, and because I trust them. So Ayers is the person who did the Washington Forest Reserve, and we'll get to him in a second. Lieberg is an untrained teenage Swedish immigrant. How does this even happen? It happens because he's been paying attention since he was 15, and he never stops. He never turns his mind off. He can't turn his mind off. And here's a great example of this. This is a picture that he takes, a photograph at the summit of Nez Perce Pass. It's on a glass plate. First of all, we look at it and we go, "Oh yeah, Paul said this is all forested in now," which it is. But you can see how there's not very many trees on it then. But it's a tribal encampment. Lieberg goes and talks to the people in the teepees. They are from 3 different language families, not 3 different Salish groups. It's Bitterroot Salish, it's Nez Perce, and it's Shoshone, all in a common fall encampment where they've come for years to gather different things and hunt. And one of the things they're after is cultural medicinal plants. Lieberg trades one of the Bitterroot Salish men he meets for some of the plants, sends them back to Coville. So you got to figure out what's going on with this. So again, Nez Perce Pass becomes a very interesting place in this photograph for a variety of reasons. And Lieberg's trying to keep track of all of them. Then he goes home. So National Geographic is a pretty cool magazine, and it hasn't been in business very long. You can look at the masthead there, associate editors, C. Hart Merriam's on it, Henry Gannett's on it, but Gifford Pinchot's publishing stories in it all the time. The very next year, 1900, he publishes an article about forest fires that, again, has a lot of the language that I was telling you sounds like some of Lieberg's letters to Elizabeth Britain. But this 1899 one, Frederick Coville encourages Lieberg to take out some of this incredible, some of these huge chunks of words that he's putting into his reports and publishing them as separate papers. And this is one on the tug of war that Paul was talking about. Everywhere he goes, he sees this tug of war between the hot, dry, and the high, cool, wet. And he thinks that by looking at the places that he has been, like Wiesner Peak to Latour Baldy, or like the Bitterroot Ridges, that some of the alpine communities that he's seeing are losing ground to some of the lower elevation plants. So he does an article on climate change in National Geographic in 1899. There's so much to try to get your mind around that I'm just going to go to the next slide. But it speaks to what we're trying to understand now. So here's Ayers. This is H.B. Ayers, who, to give you an idea of how big the Washington Reserve was in this world. And again, Lieberg had been up in this in 1893 when he was doing a plant survey when they hadn't even started doing them yet. So Pinchot and Gannett posted H.B. Ayers out there, who's a professional forester. And he's also a terrific photographer. Lieberg didn't take any photographs nearly as funny as this, with the homesteaders fiddling out in front of his cabin. This is in the Skagit, Upper Skagit. But the area of the Washington Reserve, now it encompassed both sides of the divide, and it encompassed both the Mount Baker and Snoqualmie forests and the Okanagan and Wenatchee forests. So I'm thinking just about everybody who's listening today has spent time or still works in one of those places. And you can go online and get this report that Ayers did that is a very cool report that has all kinds of information in it about what the forests look like, but it doesn't have the breadth of theory and I don't want to say overheatedness that Lieberg's put into it, but Lieberg is so into what he's doing that it's really amazing. Ayers is much more professional. And the more surveys Lieberg does, the more professional they get, the more course they get. So here's an example. Now, again, Pinchot and Gannett are in charge of sending people out. They can choose anybody they want to go do a forest survey. But Lieberg has proved that he can do a survey, that he can handle the horses and equipment, that he can talk to local people, and that he can get his report out, which, as we know, isn't always that easy after you've done the field work. So these are the forests surveyed by the forest reserves, surveyed by John Lieberg prior to them becoming national forests. And it's over 30 national forests. And the circles are in relation to the size. So we throw out the 1893 plant survey, which would make a big circle in the Cascades there, and just go to all these other places. They're sending him to Yellowstone, to the Little Belts, to the Absarokas, to the Siskiyous, to the Gold Country in California, to all those ones above Los Angeles, and to the San Franciscos, which is the mecca of forest ecology. It's where John Muir met Pinchot, and where Aldo Leopold was the first forest ranger on this forest. But John Lieberg is the man who did the forest survey. And when he does his forest survey, he says, this is a grassland. This is a grassland, and they're grazing like crazy and tearing all the native grasses out. If you go to the Arizona State Herbarium in Tempe, there are all these grasses collected by John Lieberg in their collection, because he wanted to get them notified because they were going out. He saw they were going out. He also saw that there was a lot more lightning strike fires in this area. So he had people complaining to him saying, oh, the loggers are doing this, this is the reason this is messing up. He goes, no, every forest is different. This one is being overgrazed. That's what's causing problems here. We gotta put some rules on this. And that's what the Forest Service, that's the aim of the Forest Service, to put some logical rules set by people who are paying attention and who are working in consort with each other and with the people on the ground and the people who live there. That's the idea. And that's the idea that, this whole conference is trying to get at. And it, it's had its ups and downs over the last 100 years since it started, but it's still there. The concept is still there, and it will work. And I just have to close with one look. This is Pack Saddle Peak, which is Lieberg's favorite mountain. It's only 6,500 or something like that, but it's about 500 feet taller than any of the other peaks in the Coeur d'Alenes and Pend d'Oreille range up there. It's all talus on top. And right now we're looking at the same look that we did in the earlier slide, where you're looking where the flood busted out of Lake Pend d'Oreille. Lieberg's homestead is right in the middle of the triangle there. The famous Y-shaped avalanche chute on Bernard Peak is to the left. That's named after his and Carrie's son, Bernard. Cape Horn is to the right. And if you go up there now, Lieberg has a plant list from this peak. It has great plants on it, like Sandberg's Lomatium, which is a biscuit root that grizzly bears like in the spring, that Sandberg took back to Minneapolis and got named after himself, even though Lieberg showed it to him. Now you go there, and the huckleberries and raspberries grow all the way up into the talus. There is no more alpine here. So that's just, again, that's one thing. The alpine has disappeared in 125 years from this one little peak in North Idaho, and it's not very tall. So there's no place for the Sandberg's Lomatiums to go, for these biscuit roots to go, because they're a high altitude plant and they're out of business. So I just think that looking at Lieberg's work and his reports and thinking about how he came to the conclusions he did can help us frame the questions that we are trying to ask, that we have so much more technology and so many more tools to deal with. But again, we have so much more of a complicated situation that requires every single ounce of energy we have to get straight. So I think the real lesson is he put the energy in. He really did. He put the energy in. So it's our job now to do the same. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jack. We definitely have time for questions, and following questions, This is open mic time and time for networking. Some might call this early happy hour, but it's also the time for attending the student poster session that's been set up. And in your programs, let's see what page is that. Your programs on page 7. There's information about the student poster session. So please check that out today. When does that start? Does that start at 4? Andrea, are you on?
I am. I think it's dependent upon when Jean has it set up.
Okay. Oh, okay. Brendan just put into the chat box the meeting ID for accessing the student poster session. So so here's where we could split apart. Jack, are you good with a few questions?
I absolutely am. Yeah.
Okay, super. Well, then let's start with mine. And I have 2. So I had a question regarding, you mentioned the Paulina Lakes, and I'm unfamiliar with that area. And you talked about the mountain hemlock, and there was a bunch of brown trees.
Yes.
And I was just curious, was that mountain pine beetle that
I'd love to know. I'd love to have
That
somebody smart
is in
that's in here
Lodgepole.
tell me.
Okay.
Paulina is it's part of Newberry Craters south of Bend. If you've ever driven south of Bend and seen that amazing crater, it's part of this huge national monument that they thought about. It was between Paulina Caldera and Crater Lake to make a national park out of, and they chose Crater Lake. But Paulina is very much like it and equally amazing. It has a few more trees in it.
Well, we just happen to have the Forest Health Program manager
Oh, perfect.
attending this program. It was responsible for that area, so I can ask for Karen Ripley to step in here if she's still around. Now she has her
Yeah,
hand up.
I'm here. I put my hand up. I want
Oh,
to,
great.
yeah, that caught my attention too. And, if mountain hemlock was this guy, one of his favorite trees, I have no doubt that he correctly identified that it was there 100 years ago. So I want to check it out. There's not really a bark beetle that kills mountain hemlock. And so it might be a fur engraver beetle or western balsam.
I guess
bark
there was,
beetle.
I did walk around the caldera there, and there's mountain hemlock, but it's a very mixed forest, and there's a lot of grand fir in there.
Yeah,
as well.
I'd suspect fur engraver beetle or western balsam bark beetle. And if you tell me the year of your visit and you took the picture, I'll cross-check it with the aerial survey information.
Somebody else took that picture, unfortunately.
Ah.
I didn't have my drone at the time.
Well, I can look at it just from that
Okay.
orientation. I actually took a screenshot. when
Oh,
you
cool.
were showing
Cool.
it.
Yeah, it's an amazing, I mean, that caldera is mind-boggling to me. I didn't really know about it, and I was just sort of, following his route, because that's what I do. I try to go to the same place he went the same day of the year. And I got up there and just could not believe it. I mean, it's like a road. You can walk around
Yeah.
both lakes there. It's a long walk, but it's
There's
It's
a really
amazing.
cool installation of a white bark pine educational trail.
yeah.
And when you're up
yeah.
on the top, you can look down at another like volcanic dome that's
Mhm.
completely obsidian. And it glints and shines in the sun. It's on my short list of places to go see too.
Yes.
But
and
I'll
he-
check out the bark beetle and get back to Andy.
So he got up on that and looked east and realized, and he just spent a whole month on all these places east, and he realized that all of them sort of fed in here. And he saw, you can see all these other, like you say, cones, all these other crazy volcanic features there. And he just had a fit, is what he did.
Yeah, super cool place.
Well, thanks. The other question I had was, did Lieberg ever make any comments about the lines, the strand lines on Mount Sentinel since he spent time in the Bitterroot?
Yeah, that's funny. He didn't, he worked in Hamilton for a winter. So you would think that he would have seen it at one of those times, what, sometimes the snow will sit on it where it's just all horizontal lines. But no, he talks about he definitely sees the flood features at Horse Plains and hints at the one at Camas Prairie on the Clark Fork. But that was when he was, like any of us, he accumulated knowledge as he went to all these places, and he's, if he went back to them, then he could really see it. It just depends on the order in which he did his plant surveys, really.
What do we have? I'm trying to look for any other questions, but I don't see. Oh, here's a new one. It says, Jack, I really enjoyed your presentation. Who is this? Oh, this is Jenny Noth. So Jenny was our past chair for Society of American Foresters 1 or 2 times ago. I'm reading another of your books now. Your storytelling really brings the history alive. Thank you.
That's not a question.
I guess not.
I appreciate it, though.
Okay. Let me see. Who was this?
Hey, Andy, it's Brendan real quick. I just want to double check that I got that meeting ID correct for the poster session. Andrea, could you double check that I got that right?
No, so actually
Okay.
that is the meeting ID for the happy hour. So the poster session is actually going to be hosted on Green River College's Zoom account, Zoom. And so I need to share the meeting link for their Zoom. So I think we're switching over to the meeting platform, if I'm remembering correctly. So that way there's more interaction, because right now we're still in the webinar.
The other comment was Karen Ripley's, I guess. And so she's going to follow up with me and I'll get that information out. I think we will, we plan to post the script and this recording for everybody who wants to review it or missed some of it, so they can see it again. And with these webinars that we've been doing at WSU for the last year, we've been following up and answering all the questions that get put into the chats. Since I expect everybody that's at this conference to have a more collegial relationship with the other presenters, I guess I would encourage you to just reach out to the presenter if you have any questions, and you can dig deeper rather than me trying to boil it down and get you a short response to the question. But in terms of Karen Ripley's research, I'll get that out and we'll send that out to the people who registered for the program. So Andrea, you've just posted the or the Zoom information for the poster session.
Correct. Yeah, I'm not sure if Gene is, I don't see him online right now, so I will send him a quick email to let him know that we've shared the link. So.
Okay. And is there a time that is formal, that the students are expecting it to start?
I don't believe so. I think he was just going to keep it open to when we shifted over to the happy hour, that they were going to be live at that time.
Okay. And then this other meeting ID is for the happy hour, where it'll be in the meeting format and everybody can interact, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions jumping up for Jack. You're certainly welcome to stay with us, Jack. And I want to thank you so much for coming back as a repeat offender for SAF. You were here, you volunteered to be here last year. You were here 7 or 9 years before that. And Your books are great. And they're always so relevant to some sort of topic that we're featuring at that time. I believe it was restoration that was our theme. Dry forest restoration was our theme the last time our chapter hosted this program. And it was interesting. The chief, Vicki Christensen, used the term random acts of restoration. And it really was. We featured what the Forest Service was doing. We featured what the DNR was doing. We featured some other activities on private land. And this, look where we've come in
Yeah, it is.
Since-
It's different. Yeah.
since the last time. And now we're talking about doing all these, still working on restoration, but working on it together. So we're advancing, and change really is progress, I think. And I guess I get to see you next week, which is extra fun for me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming and joining us.
Okay. Yeah, and just email me if anything else comes up.
Okay. Thank
All
you.
right.
All right. So with that, we adjourn on time.